All right, now I have used the pathfinder and I hit exclude right there, and I filled it with black. So now, and I can check it by moving it all over onto the gray, and now you see that those whites are no longer white, they are cutouts. And that's what I want here. I want those to be cutouts. And I don't want to have to alter it within Photoshop because then that rasterizes the thing. So I'm going to delete these. And I'm going to go back to Illustrator. Move this back. So many steps. They all make sense. Save it again. And save it as the AI version, just so I have it. Okay, and now my EPS, because I resaved it, let's open it up. Oh, I can't tell there. And I'm going to bring that smart object, I'm going to minimize Illustrator, bring that smart object, drag and drop into my Photoshop file, which is 8 by 10 inches at 350 pixels per inch. Make sure it's print resolution, 350. And if this is my mat around it and this is the paper, I have to decide what's going to look good. Think of it like you're opening the book. You're opening a book and you see just one illustration on the page. How much white space should be around it? Okay. And now let me check. Just by turning off the white background, I can see that that is now empty. But if I want to check the versatility, I can make a duplicate of that background layer and then fill it with middle gray. That will be helpful when I add color in the next step. And yes, now this logo is what I want. So now what do? Well, I save this as a PSD file. So Carl assignment 6, black on white logo, PSD, Photoshop file, to the desktop. And now I'm going to turn off the background and save it as a PNG file. And that will allow it to be the way you see most logos online, as transparent objects. Okay, so now I have that PNG. Let me mark that. That's what I'm going to put into PhotoBucket. And because it's a PNG, it will show whatever the website background is behind it. So this is like a black cutout shape that will go into PhotoBucket. All right. Exciting times. Assignment 6. Instructor demonstrations. And this is why I saved to the desktop, just so it's really easy to find it and upload it. And logos should be pretty small, easy assignments. So there it is. And you can see the gray background behind it. And then I'm going to call that Carl 2. Now what's the other thing I need to submit? My sketch. I don't think I've done that yet. My sketch will be Carl 1. And then Carl 3 will be a color version of the logo, which should just add to its impact. It shouldn't hurt it. Let's see. I had my sketchbook sketch. What happened to that? Well, I will do this as my sketch. This is my original sketch, my leaf tree. Nope. Not doing what I want. All right. right there. Or I could take my original, I'll just do my raster PNG here, so it relates. So this was the one I did in by hand. Actually, did I draw it in Photoshop? I think I drew it in Photoshop. So there was my sketch. And so if I zoom in on that, you'll see the raster problems with it, the grayscale, the softness of it. Even drawn in Photoshop at a pretty high resolution, when you look up close, it breaks up quite a bit. Okay, and then when I compare that to my vector finished product, this is much, much cleaner. All right, so this will be Carl 1. So now all that's left is adding color. And color can do a few different things in Illustrator. To look at some past examples, just a black on white logo, you can add effects within Photoshop of things like drop shadows like this. You can add flat color and shapes and drop shadows. That's flat color behind. Or you can kind of do what I've done here. This is the black robot. You can fill with a gradation of color. So you have lots of different options, but the color you add shouldn't change the logo substantially. It should just add another component to it. So let's play with it in Photoshop first. So I saved this as a PSD file, and I put a gray background behind it precisely so I can now do this. Duplicate it, turn off the black and white layer underneath. It's still a smart object. Then double click on it and use some of these layer styles that we got introduced to with our GIF animating. The first I can do is a color overlay, and I can choose a color. So this is an Earth Day logo, so maybe like a green, like a mossy green. That's kind of nice. How does it look on white? Yeah, that's not bad. That works as a color logo. It's not very exciting, but I can add other effects too, like maybe a gradient. And I can take my color and I can play the opacity down on top of a gradient, and I can make that color more saturated if I want. The gradient I can have on multiply mode, right? Or I can have it on these different overlays, like screen mode is effective. And it will affect my color. And I have it as a linear gradient. I can change the angle of the gradient, see what best suits. I can change how subtle or how strong that gradient is, depending on what I can do for my logo. And all of these are still using your smart layer. As long as you don't rasterize your layer, you're still keeping all of your vector properties. You're just adding different color options to it now. I can even do some of these fancy things, like a bevel and emboss with a contour. So then it makes it look like a fancy corporate logo version, even though this is all just from my vector. That actually looks pretty nice. And it's good not to overdo it, right? I can add a texture. I can add it, make it really bumpy, like it's on a fancy paper. I can play with the depth and the subtlety of it. Now it's like mountain hiking gear. Now it's soft and subtle. Just enough of organic. An organic quality logo that you can still charge a lot for. I can play with inverting the depth, just make it a little bit more unique. I can play with inner shadows. I can add a stroke around the whole thing. I can play with the width of that stroke. I can make that stroke on the inside of the line to help it pop a little bit. I can change the color of that stroke. And maybe, since NLC the colors are blue and green, I can just make that really subtle stroke color, a vibrant blue. So much you can do. You can increase the size. I can play with its opacity. But again, doing too much is a bad idea. You want it to make sense. And so what I like about these layer styles is you can just turn them on and off. And then maybe one of the most fun, the bevel and emboss is not one I often use, but it adds some contrast right into it, makes it pretty strong. One I often use is drop shadow. In drop shadow, you can actually add a color, an accent color if you want. So I might use a blue there. And then you can play with the distance, the angle, the spread, the size. So this might be a nice subtle way to set off my design, as long as you pick the right things, right? And all of these can be adjusted. So the angle of the gradient, I can even make it a color gradient if I want. Let's make it a rainbow kind of gradient on top of the green. But all of these are just acceptable variations of that very important black and white logo. That's pretty nice. Get a little warmth and cool in there, change the angle a little bit. Let's see, do I like that better? I don't know. Maybe. And of course, you can actually click on the gradient and set your own exact colors if you want. So instead of it being violet, I could warm that up a little. Actually, cool it down a little. And instead of orange, I can make this a little bit more yellow. And you see how it's starting to change it. Yeah, I like that. Okay, so now all of these effects, I started with this, with the effects to color them, they look like that. And you see the core logo shape is there. It just has an emboss, it has a texture, it has a fill color, it has a drop shadow. It's got a gradient, and each of those things can be turned off and on. And they're all acceptable variations. So I want you to come up with what you think is your best color solution. So now I'm going to save that as Carl Assignment 6, Color Logo, PSD. And then to put it onto PhotoBucket, I turn off the background and I save that as Carl Assignment 6, Color Logo, PNG. And then we can add that on. New versions of Photoshop, they take a while to save PNGs. And I think that's just because their optimization is pretty high now. And as long as you made all the right decisions early on, and that all of your white shapes are truly cutouts, you can get away with coloring it in Photoshop like that. And this one would be called Carl 3. And I don't know why PhotoBucket kind of intensifies color. I think they're just trying to make bland photos a little bit more interesting. Because you can see the slight difference in saturation there. But that is my color version, and that is my black and white version.